Continuing Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism by Gershom G. Scholem. The Zohar 1, its book and its author. In the following year, he published a fairly voluminous treatise on the meaning of the commandments, Sefer Ha-Ramon, the Book of the Pomegranate. Both, but in particular the latter, are replete with allusions to mystical sources. Although the Zohar is never directly mentioned, a detailed analysis shows that he is already making systematic use of all its parts, from the Midrash Ha-Nilam to the commentaries of the main part on Leviticus and Numbers. But even before Moses de Leon made his appearance as a Hebrew author, quotations for the Zohar, to be exact, from the Midrash Ha-Nilam, began to appear in the writings of two other Kabbalists, thus confirming our view of the order in which the various parts of the Zohar were written and began to circulate. The oldest quotation from the Zohar dates from the year 1281, as to be found at the end of the Mashal Ha-Kadmani. I'm not sure whether that's supposed to be a Q or a K sound. By Isaac ibn Abu Sahula. It is a passage taken from the Midrash Ha-Nilam, or rather from the above-mentioned version, hitherto unknown, of a paragraph on Genesis, which I had the good fortune to discover in a Cambridge manuscript of the Zohar. The author, who, like Moses de Leon, lived in Guadalajara 2 years later, wrote a mystical commentary to the Song of Songs. He does not there quote the full text of the passages from the genuine Midrashim to which he alludes, but he does make use of a good number of quotations from an obviously unknown and unpublished Midrash, none other than the Midrash Ha-Nilam, to the first 3 Sidras of the Torah. At about the same time, Todras Abelafia appears to have written his Atzar HaKavod, Treasury of the Glory, where one finds 2 quotations from the Midrash Ha-Nilam, the title of which is again not mentioned. Both writers, who for various reasons may safely be excluded from the list of possible authors of the Zohar, maintain close relations with Moses de Leon, the former being a resident of the same locality, and the latter a wealthy friend to whose son several of Moses de Leon's works are dedicated. Taken all together, these facts permit us to draw the following conclusions. The Midrash Ha-Nilam, the forerunner of the Zohar proper, was written between 1275 and 1280, probably not long before the latter year, while the bulk of the work was completed in the years 1280 to 1286 of the Common Era. After the latter date, Moses de Leon, in his various writings, mingles a constant proportion of quotations from the Zohar among his other quotations from the Midrashim and commentaries. Till about 1293, in particular, he appears to have worked fairly intensively on the publication of writings designated to propagate the doctrines of the Zohar, probably in conjunction with his work. Certainly after 1290, he also began to circulate copies of the main Zohar among other Kabbalists. Bahya ben Asher of Saragossa, who started work on his great Torah commentary in 1291, appears to have read certain chapters of these copies of the new Kabbalistic Midrash, which was at first calculated not only under the title Zohar, but also as the Midrash of Rabbi Simeon ben Yochai. Probably on the basis of these texts, another Kabbalist, either in the 90s of the 13th or at the beginning of the 14th century, the Common Era, wrote the Greya Mehemna and the Tikkunim in general. There seems to have been no lack of imitations. David ben Yehuda, the grandson of Nachmanides, in his Maroth Ha-Tizvaoth, written at the beginning of the 14th century, the Common Era, quotes, apart from various authentic Zoharic passages, some lengthy pieces, written in the manner of the Midrash Hanilam and the Zohar, whose contents show them to be imitations of these two books. That such imitations were produced is in itself proof that some Kabbalists did not take the literary form of the Zohar too seriously, but regarded it as pure fiction, which they had no hesitation to copy. No doubt there were also unsophisticated souls who accepted the book as a genuine midrash, even as an authentic work of the disciples of Simeon ben Yochai. Its masterly presentations of the secret thoughts and feelings of the contemporary Kabbalists was far too true to reality not to have excited the wish of this romantic projection of their own spiritual world might really prove to have been the secret doctrine of the Midrash teachers. At once hoary with antiquity and sanctified by authority, the proportion of critical minds at that time was no greater than it is in our own day. Nevertheless, criticism was not completely lacking. As late as 1340, Joseph ibn Walker of Toledo, almost the only Kabbalist known to us, who wrote in Arabic, warned his readers to exercise caution in using the Zohar, as it contained a great many errors. Well, people claim that there were errors in the Bible that I think were intentional in the way they wrote it, but, like Shathan instead of Sathan. But how true is the book overall? That should be the thing. But yeah, as an absolute authority, once you find out that something's full of errors, this solution of the Zoharic problem accords, so far as I can see, complete with all the circumstances which the critic must bear in mind as to the motive which prompted the writing of the Zohar. Immediately prior to its publication, the general remarks of Eduard Zeller, the historian of Greek philosophy, are still true. Another who writes under an assumed name wants to produce a certain effect in his own time. He will, therefore, circulate his work immediately. And if the first who read it regard it as genuine, the growth of its circulation will perhaps be more rapid than if it had appeared under the real name of its author. Only where a book is inadvertently attributed to the wrong author because the real one is unknown, and without its author having any part in the mistake, will a length of time be required as a rule before it begins to circulate. Having disposed of all the fantasies about the various parts of the Zohar belonging to different periods, about its sources, and its supposed interpretation from the East, as well as of all doubts that it was not only published, but also written in Castile, the inner dynamic of the process which led to its inception and circulation is now clearly revealed before our eyes. Now, isn't there an account somewhere where it basically the guy's wife is, after he died, that told people, Moses de Leon's wife, what was her name? There is another consideration which may be mentioned, at least in passing. Some defenders of the Zohar as a book composed of many different elements in different periods have argued that it is impossible to assume that a vast production like the Zoharic literature could have been the result of a few years' work. In our case, of 6 years. This is a serious error in judgment. Precisely the contrary is true. If a man writes under the spell of inspiration, if he has found an Archimedean point around which his spiritual work is focused, it is indeed easy for him to produce thousands of pages within a very limited period. We have the example of the famous German mystic Jacob Boehme, who produced during the 6 years, 1618 to 1624, an even vaster theosophic literature than the Zohar. And before we get into part 9, remember how much Aleister Crowley wrote. Adulterants to drugs were really cutting back on all sorts of abilities far more than the normal aging process towards the end there, but at times he was producing, easily 1,000 pages a year, if not, there remains only one last question. Who was the author? Was it Moses de Leon himself or an unknown writer who moved in Moses de Leon's circle and managed to shield his identity from the glaring light of posterity? Can the possibility be wholly discarded that another Kabbalist, whose identity has been lost in the dark remoteness of the past, had the main share in the work? It can at least be said that by some of his contemporaries, Moses de Leon was already described as the author of the Zohar. That much, at any rate, we know from the much-discussed testimony of the Kabbalist Isaac ben Samuel of Acre, one of the two documents of the period apart from Moses de Leon's own writings in which we find him mentioned. Isaac left his home when he was still a young student after the conquest of Acre by the Muslims in 1291 of the Common Era, apparently for Italy, where he also seems to have heard of the Zohar, and finally went to Spain in 1305, where he began to take an interest in the circumstances under which the book was published, his diary, of which a few other parts have also been preserved in manuscript, gives a rather naive account of the information he gathered on the subject. We are told that he met Moses in Valladolid and was informed under an oath that he, Moses de Leon, was in possession of the ancient book written by Simeon ben Yochai and would show it to him in his house at Avila. Subsequently, when after Moses de Leon's death he came to Avila, he was told that a rich citizen of the town, Joseph de Avila, had offered to marry his son to the daughter of the deceased in exchange for the original manuscript of the Zohar, said to be ancient as well as authentic, from which Moses de Leon was supposed to have copied, but that both the widow of the deceased and his daughter had denied the existence of such an original. According to them, Moses de Leon had written the Zohar all by himself, and to his wife's question why he did not claim authorship of the work, he had replied, "If I told people that I am the author, they would pay no attention nor spend a farthing on the book. For they would say that these are but the workings of my own imagination." Now, this kind of is the argument of why they put the names of Moses and the others. Certainly it might have contained something. It certainly represented the actual revelation received to Moses and Isaiah and the rest of them. But if it was just if they announced to the public, this is our representative novel of what Moses was, and the early Israelites or something were all about, Tanakh wouldn't have had the influence that it would, or, it probably wouldn't have anyways. But now that they hear, I am copying the book Zohar, which Simeon ben Yochai wrote under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, they are paying a high price for it, as you know. Isaac of Acre, who did not himself speak to Moses de Leon's widow, but relates all this as second or rather third-hand information, also speaks of further researches, but unfortunately his accounts, as quoted by a latter chronicler of the 15th century of the Common Era, breaks off at the very point where he proposes to disclose what he was told under the solemn oath by a pupil of Moses de Leon about the book Zohar, which was written by Rabbi Simeon ben Yochai, and it's 1443 in the sacred calendar, of the migration, Al-Hijra. But anyways, I don't remember what it is, the Hebrew calendar, because they add up the years in the Bible, 50, so, it's getting close to 6,000, isn't it? Whether Isaac of Acre, who later became one of the leading Kabbalists of the first half of the 14th century, believed in the authenticity of the Zohar, remains obscure. That he quotes it several times in his own writings does not imply belief in its antiquity. On the other hand, it is of some interest that he repeatedly contrasts the Catalan and the Castilian tradition of Kabbalism. According to him, the former school based its teachings on the doctrine expounded in the book Bahir, the latter on the Zohar. In other words, he postulates a close connection between the Zohar and the Kabbalism of Castile, on the account given by Isaac of Acre, in particular of the alleged evidence of Moses de Leon's widow. Gratz has based his impression of Moses de Leon, on whom he pours the full measure of the wrath kindled in him by the Book of Lies. According to him, Moses de Leon was an idle and impetuous. Moses de Leon was an idle and impecunious charlatan who made use of the increasingly fashionable Kabbalah in order to pose as a writer on the subject, and thus opened up a rich source of income for himself. The foundation of this startling assertion is the mistaken assumption that Moses de Leon began by writing under his own name and descended to pseudepigraphy from thoroughly mean and worthless motives, i.e., because his original writings had failed to win him sufficient laurels and profits. Hence, he is supposed to have written the whole Zohar after 1293, including the Midrash Hanilam, the Reya Mahemna, and the Tekkunim, that his view of the author's personality and the date and form of his work is thoroughly mistaken and should be clear after our conclusions on the subject, which are the result of a somewhat more detailed analysis. Having established this point, I have no hesitation in saying that Gratz's fanciful picture of Moses de Leon as a base and despicable swindler who tried to parade a fake profundity of thought and his other moral strictness on his character can be dismissed as pure fantasy. Now, I would disagree that, the work is as strong as it is, whether or not the guy lied about the origins. Now, don't lie about the origins if you will, of stuff, but, there's nothing in the character of the Zohar and of Moses de Leon's Hebrew writings which justifies this view of the book and its author. Nor is there anything critical in them which might predispose one to regard the alleged cynical remark to his wife as authentic. On the contrary, the manner in which this remark is related rather suggests that it owes its origin to the spite of persons ill disposed towards the author. That his widow described him as the author of the book is indeed well possible, and as we shall see, in entire accordance with the facts. But the supposed authenticity of her particular words is a question on which it is well to exercise some restraint. One thing is certain: the actual relationship between the Zohar and Moses de Leon's other writings is the reverse of that assumed by Gratz. A detailed analysis of all the books written under his own name proves that they presuppose the existence of the Zohar as a completed work, and their obvious purpose is to prepare the readers for its publication. Unobtrusively, at first, and gradually, with growing emphasis, it appears indeed that they were intended to prepare the ground for the publication of those copies of the Zohar to which he seems to have devoted the better part of the remaining 12 years of his life. For it is difficult to believe that he can have done much copying work in the 7 years between 1286 and 1293, during which he was engaged in producing Hebrew writings, of which the part that is still preserved alone runs into close on 1,000 pages. It is interesting to note the gradual process by which quotations from the Zohar are introduced with ever-growing frequency and forthrightness. In the course of these 7 years, in the beginning, we find the author referring to the suitable vague terms to sayings of the wise or commentaries by mystics, but as time goes on, his introductions become more and more enthusiastic, and in the Mishkan Ha-Aduth, written in 1293, there are whole long passages in which he refers in a very remarkable manner to the character of these antique pearls of wisdom newly discovered by him and finally revealed. A closer analysis of this book removes the last doubt that it was intended to serve as a propagandist introduction to the Zohar. which had just been, was on the point of being published. Although it is to some extent devoted to the further development of those ideas relevant to its central theme, the eschatology of the soul, which are expounded in the Zohar, its main purpose is clearly propagandist. Notwithstanding all that has been said of the author's motives, the chronological sequence in which the Zohar was written, the question of its authorship cannot yet be said to have been answered. After all, it is still possible that Moses de Leon made use of writings which were in his possession, but not written by himself. The question, therefore, is whether it is possible to find proof positive that he was really the author of the Zohar. In regard to this question, all I can say is that after making a close study of Moses de Leon's Hebrew writings and their relation to the Midrash Hanilam and the components of the Zohar, I have come to the conclusion that they were all written by the same man. I am bound to admit that for many years, even after I had become convinced that the Zohar is the work of one writer, I was in doubt on this point. For a long time I searched for criteria which would positively exclude the possibility of Moses de Leon being the author, such as, for example, repeated flagrant misunderstandings of the text of the Zohar by Moses de Leon himself. But although hundreds of quotations from the Zohar occur in the writings published under his own name, be it textually or paraphrased, I have been unable to discover a single case in which it is possible to speak of a significant misunderstanding. I have thus come to abandon the idea that the theory of another authorship is capable of being proved. On the other hand, the assumption that the author of the Zohar was also the author of the Hebrew writings supplies an adequate explanation of all doubtful points, if it be fairly borne in mind that the writer was not willing to disclose the pseudo-epigraphic character of his work on the Zohar. What I have said does not mean that the personality of Moses de Leon and his authorship of the Zohar no longer offer any problem. To say that would be to overlook that we possess too little documentary material which goes beyond the bare rehearsal of his theosophic doctrines. Even if the proof of Moses de Leon's authorship, which I shall advance, is conclusive, the acceptance of this theory still leaves a number of questions unanswered. These questions, in particular, concern the various stages of Moses de Leon's religious development and the events which brought about his pseudepigraphic activity. This applies, for instance, to the still unresolved problems of his relationship to Joseph Gikatilla. There can be no doubt that Moses de Leon, too, began as a follower of Maimonides and was only gradually attracted by the study of Kabbalism. This is plain enough from the philosophical elements of his Hebrew writings, and in addition we have the clearest documentary proof in the form of a manuscript described in the autographed catalogue of the Gunzburg collection of the Hebrew manuscripts now in Moscow of the Hebrew translation of Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed, which was written in 1264 for the erudite Ha-Maskil, Rabbi Moses de Leon. The absence of further honorifics suggests that he was at that date still a young man, although of sufficient means to be able to pay for a private copy of so voluminous a book. We shall probably not go wrong in assuming that he was born around 1240, the period of more than 20 years between 1264 and 1286. We may picture as being filled with intensive study and gradual development toward mysticism, with its latter half devoted to the writing of the Zohar in the manner outlined in the foregoing pages. From all we know, it would appear that in the 70s he made the acquaintance of Joseph Gikatilla, who at that time was a zealous follower of the school of prophetic Kabbalism founded by Abraham Abulafia. Although the two Kabbalists never mention each other by name, a study of their writings leads one to the conclusion that each had a considerable share in influencing the other. To begin with, Moses de Leon, it is plain enough that although he nowhere approaches the main points of Abulafia's doctrine itself, which does not seem to have aroused his enthusiasm, or perhaps he just didn't want to oppose it, his writings, and particularly those in Hebrew, reflect the influence of Gikatila's Ganon Agaz in their treatment of the mysticism of letters and similar subjects. In some passages, the influence of the Ganath Agaz is so striking that on the face of it one might be inclined to ascribe the authorship to Gikatila. On the other hand, it is certain that it was not Gikatila through whom Moses de Leon was led to the Sephirothic Kabbalah, for Gikatila, during the first period of his literary activity, i.e. the period during which the Zohar was written, showed hardly any understanding for the theosophic conception of mysticism. The spiritual development of Gikatila, too, shows evidence of a definite change of outlook. In his latter writings, there is hardly a trace of the influence of Abulafia and the characteristic ideas of the Ganath Agaz. Instead, he displays all signs of having gone over body and soul to the doctrine of theosophic Kabbalism. The influence of the Zohar is plain in all his latter writings, although the form in which it is expressed differs widely from that which we find in the case of Moses de Leon. It would appear that Moses de Leon's theosophical trend of mind very deeply influenced his own development. Unfortunately, we have no knowledge of the actual personal relations between these two Kabbalists. Did Gikatila know of the pseudo-epigraphic character of the Zohar? He, too, propagates its ideas, particularly in his Share Ora. There's a few letters that they could have as O, so I'm not sure about that one. But his references to the source of these doctrines are limited to vague allusions to the words of the wise. This systematic failure to mention the name of the Zohar must have been in accordance with some definite purpose. The title of Gikatila's work originally was Sefer HaOrah, i.e. the Book of Light. Oh, Aura, okay. Which Aura is also the name of the private part, which from the male includes the needs to the navel, and the women obviously have more areas where sexual arousal is possible, so more areas are covered. In Semitic text originated religions, they can still have their feet and their hands and their face uncovered. That's agreed upon. Some people say that some of that can be dropped when they get old, but it's kind of if they get feeble or something, I can understand leniency or something, but it's kind of insulting. Yeah, you're old enough. You're too old to have children, so, no, it's at least better to keep up whatever modesty you had earlier in life or something, right? Or improve it or something. But anyways, that's a different point, and this is talking about something different, which sounds almost like a paraphrase of Sefer HaZohar, or the Book of Splendor. By all accounts, it is written during the years when Moses de Leon began to circulate the first copies of the Zohar. Now, Besht, the shame, in the Jewish texts, they're more likely to refer to the private parts with the word Besht than Aura would be the pronunciation in Aramea or Hebrew or something, but those are through different. Already in 1293 of the Common Era, Moses de Leon, in 3 different passages of his book, Mishkan Ha-Eduth, quotes the words of the wise in the Shar Orah, grumbling the tumbler here. It is not clear whether the Gates of Light is one of the several assumed names under which the Zohar appears in Moses de Leon's other writings, or whether the reference is to Gikatila's book. On the one hand, there is the fact that one of the passages quoted is in fact to be found in the first chapter of Gikatila's book. It is written in a terminology particularly characteristic of this writer. On the other hand, the 2 passages mentioned are not to be found in Gikatila's work, and there is the further point that since Gikatila wrote under his own name, his book does not purport to be the work of the ancient rabbis. It is therefore permissible to conclude that Moses de Leon had read only the first chapter of Gikatila's still incomplete work, and that, in his veiled hints as to the existence of the Zohar, he made playful use of the title of his friend's book. that would at least not be out of harmony with his general habits as a writer. In any event, it appears likely that Attila had read the Zohar already before 1293, and that he had conceived the idea of making its mystical symbolism on the subject of his own works. It may be that in propagating the new ideas, he acted in accordance with Moses de Leon's own wishes. He himself cannot possibly have been the author of the Zohar. Not one of the criteria of authorship to which we must now turn our attention applies to his own original writings as compared with the Zohar, but it is likely enough that as a member of Moses de Leon's closest circle, and as his friend, who was at one hand at the same time his teacher and his disciple, he played a part in the preliminaries of the writing and publication of the Zohar, a part which, at the present time, we are still unable to determine. Before we get into part 10, most religious traditions, as they will be called, have this pseudo-epigraphic sort of way of writing sacred history and stuff like this. It doesn't mean that they don't do their best to convey what's being passed around of the teachings and what happened around the teachings and claims of visions and that sort of stuff to the prophets or sages or whatever. It's just they weave it into an account when it tends to be broken pieces of one sort or another. It all goes without saying that it is no more possible to solve the riddle of Moses de Leon's authorship without a detailed analysis of all the factors involved than it is possible to answer the questions when and how the Zohar as a work of literature was composed without thorough research. Nevertheless, the conclusions at which I have arrived can be summarized comparatively briefly. Moses de Leon's Hebrew writings are distinguished by a style which is peculiarly their own, and in some respects differs sharply from that of Attila. Its special mark is an admixture of rhymed prose and an abundance of scriptural tags in the precious and flowery manner of erudite Hebrew literature in medieval Spain, and in a very awkward prose fabric of his own. Clearly it would be idle to look for anything like that in the Zohar, where the author had to put up with a language, Aramaic, which did not offer him the advantage of a stock of ready-made phrases and semi-poetical quotations. On the other hand, this flowery style, which he drops not infrequently, does not prevent one from discerning the texture of what might be called, with some justification, his real language. Now, the point is that while many peculiarities of his authentic speech are not found in the writings of any other contemporary author, not even